Welcome back. I'm glad you made it to Module 2, The Mind According to Jung. The mind remains one of the greatest frontiers of exploration, not unlike the vast oceans or distant planets. Yet, unlike those external territories, this landscape exists within each of us, influencing every aspect of our lives in ways we often fail to recognize. Carl Jung offered us perhaps the most comprehensive map of this inner territory, a way of understanding the layers and dynamics of our psyche that goes far beyond the simplified view of consciousness versus unconsciousness. Today, we'll explore Jung's remarkable map of the mind, not as an abstract academic exercise, but as a practical guide to understanding the forces that shape your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and experiences. This understanding forms the foundation for everything else in Jungian psychology. Let's begin with the most familiar territory, the conscious mind. This is the realm of awareness, the part of your psyche that you identify as you. At the center of consciousness is what Jung called the ego, not in the popular sense of being egotistical, but simply the organizing center of your conscious identity, your sense of I. The ego maintains your sense of continuity and identity over time. It organizes your perceptions, thoughts, memories, and intentions into a coherent narrative that you recognize as your life. Without the ego, you wouldn't experience yourself as a distinct individual with agency and purpose. Connected to the ego is what Jung called the persona, derived from the Latin word for mask, as used by actors in ancient Greek drama. Your persona is the face you present to the social world, the version of yourself adapted to the expectations and demands of society. We all have multiple personas: the professional self at work, the parental self with children, the social self with friends. These aren't necessarily false or inauthentic, but they're selective expressions of who we are, shaped by social context and expectations. Problems arise when we over-identify with our persona, mistaking our social role for our whole self, or when there's a radical disconnect between our persona and other aspects of our psyche. In Jung's view, healthy development requires both a functional persona and the recognition that we are more than our social roles. Beneath the conscious mind lies what Jung called the personal unconscious, the repository of everything we once knew or experienced, but is no longer in our conscious awareness. This includes forgotten memories, suppressed impulses, neglected talents, and repressed experiences. Unlike Freud, who focused primarily on repression, Jung recognized that much of what slips into the personal unconscious does so through natural forgetting, neglect, or simply due to limited conscious attention. Not everything in the personal unconscious is problematic or painful. Some content simply hasn't been integrated into conscious awareness. Within the personal unconscious, Jung identified structures he called complexes, clusters of emotionally charged ideas, memories, perceptions, and wishes organized around a common theme. These complexes function somewhat autonomously, like subpersonalities within the larger psyche. You might recognize common complexes in statements like, "My father complex was triggered," or "she has a real inferiority complex." While these phrases have entered popular language, Jung meant something more specific. A complex is a kind of psychic knot or charged node that, when activated, can temporarily take over our conscious functioning. Have you ever reacted to a situation with an emotional intensity that surprised even you? Or found yourself behaving in ways that later seemed unlike your normal self? These are often signs of a complex being activated. The complex brings its emotional charge into consciousness, sometimes overwhelming our usual ego identity. The personal unconscious communicates with consciousness through dreams, slips of tongue, unexpected emotions, and symptoms, all ways that unintegrated content attempts to get our attention and be acknowledged. Beneath the personal unconscious, Jung proposed an even deeper layer, the collective unconscious. This is where Jung's model departs most radically from other psychological approaches. The collective unconscious isn't formed by personal experience. Rather, it's the deepest layer of the psyche that we share with all humanity, a kind of psychological inheritance, just as our bodies inherit certain physical structures and predispositions. Jung described the collective unconscious as containing the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution born anew in the brain structure of every individual. It's not filled with specific memories or experiences, but with potentials for certain types of experiences and ways of organizing meaning. These potentials manifest as what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns or motifs that appear in the myths, stories, and symbols of all cultures throughout history. We'll explore archetypes in much greater depth in our next module, but for now, understand that they represent the fundamental ways humans experience life: birth, death, the mother, the father, the hero's journey, transformation, and countless others. Evidence for the collective unconscious appears in the remarkable similarities of myths and symbols across cultures that had no contact with each other, and the universal themes that emerge in dreams and in our instinctive emotional responses to certain primal images and situations. The collective unconscious communicates with consciousness primarily through archetypal images and symbols, often appearing in dreams, visions, art, and profound emotional experiences. These communications tend to have a numinous quality, a sense of otherworldliness or profound significance. At the deepest level of the psyche, Jung identified what he called the self, not the self in everyday language, but a specific concept representing the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, and the organizing principle of the whole personality. While the ego is the center of consciousness, the self is the center of the entire psyche. It's both the whole and the central organizing principle. Jung often represented the self through mandala symbols, circular designs that represent wholeness, integration, and the reconciliation of opposites. The relationship between ego and self is crucial. The ego develops out of the self in early childhood as consciousness forms, but ideally maintains a connection with the self throughout life. When the ego becomes inflated, ignoring the larger self, or when it becomes too rigid or defensive, psychological problems develop. In dreams and fantasies, the self often appears as a superior figure, a wise elder, a divine child, a luminous being, or other images of wholeness and transcendence. These images represent the potential for greater integration and wholeness that exists within each person. The process of individuation, which we touched on in our last video and will explore more deeply later, can be understood as the ego coming into proper relationship with the self, neither inflated nor diminished, but appropriately related to the larger wholeness of the psyche. These layers of the psyche, the conscious mind with its ego and persona, the personal unconscious with its complexes, the collective unconscious with its archetypes, and the self as the totality, aren't separate compartments, but interacting dynamic aspects of a single system. In a healthy psyche, there's ongoing dialogue between these layers. The ego remains strong enough to function effectively in the world while staying open to messages from the unconscious. The personal unconscious remains accessible enough that its contents can be integrated into consciousness when appropriate. The collective unconscious provides depth, meaning, and connection to universal human experiences without overwhelming individual identity. Problems arise when these layers become too disconnected from each other. If the ego becomes too dominant, cutting itself off from the unconscious, life may become shallow, mechanical, or devoid of meaning. If unconscious forces become too powerful without adequate ego strength to integrate them, overwhelming emotions, compulsions, or psychological symptoms may result. Think of your psyche as an ecosystem requiring balance and communication between its parts. Just as a biological ecosystem needs diversity and interconnection to remain healthy, your psychological ecosystem needs both differentiation between its structure and communication between them. So, how does this map help us in practical terms? Understanding Jung's model gives us a framework for recognizing different aspects of our experience. When we find ourselves rigidly attached to our social image, we can recognize the persona at work and ask what other aspects of ourselves might need expression. When we react with disproportionate emotion to a seemingly minor trigger, we can look for the complex that's been activated. When we dream of powerful, universal images or feel drawn to certain symbols, we might recognize the influence of the collective unconscious. And when we experience moments of profound meaning or wholeness, we might sense the self making itself known to consciousness. The goal isn't to eliminate any of these aspects, but to foster greater awareness and communication between them. Jung's psychology is fundamentally integrative. It seeks not to overcome or conquer parts of ourselves, but to bring them into relationship with each other. As we continue through this course, we'll explore the specific contents and dynamics of this inner map in greater detail. In our next video, we'll meet the cast of characters that exhibit these layers of psyche, the specific archetypes and complexes that shape our inner and outer lives. For now, I invite you to consider your own inner landscape. Which aspects of Jung's map feel most familiar to you? Which feel most distant or unfamiliar? Which layer of your psyche might be asking for more attention or acknowledgement? Remember that this exploration isn't just abstract theory. It's about understanding the living, breathing, psychological reality that shapes every moment of your existence. Okay, bye for now. See you in the next video.